Good Friday afternoon, everyone. We've diverted a little bit in our usual pattern of Thursdays and gone to Friday. But it sounds like we have lots of people coming on board and with obvious interests in the Missouri Basin. We are adding this special webinar in between our usual monthly webinars to focus specifically on the Missouri River because of the fairly large snowpack and issues going on along the Missouri River. So we will go ahead and get started here. And okay, moving on. Again, this is a collaborative effort among various service providers, federal and non-federal, throughout the Missouri Basin, including, and I forgot to, of the first slide, I realized they did not have NRCS included. They did supply information for this also, so they are part of our regional cooperative efforts among federal and non-federal partners. Our next regularly scheduled webinar will be April 17th, where this will focus on the North Central region, the Missouri River Basin, and the Corn Belt. We will likely have another Missouri Basin, Missouri River focused one on or about May 1. We need to double check when we can get the webinar capability, but on or about then we will probably do a follow-up updating conditions at that point, assuming conditions will, there will still be ample snowpack and reason for having discussion at that point. This and other previous webinars are available on the link below, and that's the access, and then they are archived at the High Plains and Midwest Regional Climate Centers. Okay, our agenda for the day is kind of current conditions and some comparisons. Obviously, a question about where we sit compared to 2011. So we'll compare to some of the things that we can for 2011. Some other pieces we don't have quite available, so we'll just talk about them. Kind of review of our river status and our snowpack conditions. What we can say for predictions on our outlook standpoint, and then we'll touch on drought, El Nino coming up. So, kind of our key points. Obviously, large mountain snowpacks are what are driving some of our concern about what's going on right now. Plain snowpack has come up a little bit. We'll talk about that here in a minute with a couple of recent events. Also, some frozen soils and moist soils in the plains will have some impact based on what's going to happen with future precipitation and runoff. Temperatures generally are still running cooler than average, except for a little bit looking like around the mountains area, which will help start the snowpack melt. From a prediction standpoint, the conditions are likely to stay on the cool side of average, especially out in the plains areas on into the spring. From a precipitation standpoint, really not a great deal to say about it at this point. We'll delve into that a little bit. We have no specific indications of any large events coming up that would impact what we can say about the Missouri River. We are likely going to have an El Nino starting. Looks more likely as we go on into the summertime. I don't think it will have a large impact on the current situation, but will have an impact likely later in the summer and into the fall. There is some minor tributary flooding expected. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Because of some of the mountain runoff, some heavy rains in Missouri, which have happened already. That's not unexpected, that sort of thing. And then a couple caveats. Those extreme individual events are very difficult to forecast, and we are reaching the time of peak accumulation in the mountain snowpack areas. Okay, kind of reviewing our situation right now from a precipitation standpoint, we're looking at the total precipitation over the last 6 months, which roughly correlates with about the beginning of the water year in early October. Total precipitation on the upper left-hand side throughout the plains, Montana, Wyoming on the left, Dakotas and Nebraska kind of in the middle right. Percent of normal, which is the more interesting part of this, over the last 6 months, looking at 150 to 200% of average precipitation throughout parts of Wyoming, Montana, and the western Dakotas, partially because of the blizzard last early October, but along some associated heavier rainfalls around that led to some fairly wet conditions last fall. You can see overall dryish conditions into Kansas, Nebraska, and northern parts of the basin not showing up very well, or where we have less than average precipitation. So kind of a mixed bag of things going on. That is driving what we're seeing in the way of soil moisture here at this point. This is an ensemble of various models, and this is depicting the total soil moisture anomaly. It's in millimeters, so you have to divide by 25 to get inches, but shows up pretty well. That area of overall wet conditions has led to wetter than average soil moisture profile in the western Dakotas on into Montana. That is running 1 to 2 or a little bit more inches above average soil moisture in those areas. And those areas we showed as dry, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, soils are several inches below average compared to this time of year. This is, again, not going to change a great deal in parts of the basin. We'll talk about soils that being frozen here in just a little bit. So this is an area that bears watching because the more moist soil moisture profiles will allow for a bit more runoff if we get some additional heavier rainfalls there. The drier profiles will obviously take up more of that moisture as it occurs. Again, this is still our area of biggest need and really lack of detailed data about the soil moisture conditions and soil moisture profile, and is something that we would love to try to improve our monitoring capabilities throughout the country, but especially in this part of the basin. Now, diverting to temperature a little bit, we don't have quite the same time periods we can look at in temperature. So 2 periods we're looking at here. On the upper left-hand side, departure from average temperatures for climatological winter, which begins December 1 to the end of February. While parts of the plains, while the whole plains have actually been below average, it's really the Dakotas and east that have been much, much colder than average, running on the order of 6 to 8 to 10 plus degrees below average. Whereas we get out in the western part of the basin, running 4 or a little bit below, or in some cases a little less than average during climatological winter. In the lower right-hand side, looking at the last 30 days, focusing a little more recently now, still running colder than average throughout the basin, not so much colder than average. And you can see even parts of Montana and parts of Wyoming there running somewhat above average, which will start to push that melt along, which will help. In 2011, our melt off with overall cool conditions was somewhat delayed. Starting the melt off can start that process of moving the snowpack along. Now focusing on the snow cover, what our snow cover situation is like. This is looking more specifically at the plain snow cover. Data from the No Risk Group compares where we are right now on the top versus 3 years ago at the same time period in 2011. These last couple events this week have dropped some more plain snowpack, and we're looking at snow water equivalent here. So in places with more than an inch of snow water equivalent on the ground in parts of North Dakota, eastern Montana, and parts of South Dakota. That does contrast with where we were 3 years ago, where some of those areas didn't have much in the way of snowpack on this specific day. One of the big differences that you see back 3 years ago is you had areas of northern Montana and parts of North Dakota that do flow in the Missouri River had much, much higher amounts of SWE still on the ground in their snowpack. We don't have that long-term snowpack sitting around right now. So the current snow will probably induce a little bit more runoff, but probably not a major impact to the overall runoff. Future precipitation amounts would obviously impact that. You can see over into Minnesota and parts of northern Wisconsin, some larger snowpack that's going to run off into the Mississippi River. Moving on, the other thing associated with the issue going on in the plains right now is the frozen soil, which is somewhat anomalous for this time of year. Typically, we are largely out of frozen conditions. So looking at 2 pieces of information here, the upper left-hand side from the High Plains Regional Climate Center, 4-inch soil temperatures, what our surfaces are like. And you can see throughout most of the Dakotas and probably extending into part of Montana, near surface soils are right at freezing, maybe a little bit frozen. So not a major issue there in some of those surface profiles, because that can go out fairly easily, can thaw out fairly easily. Probably much more concern if we were to get any kind of a major liquid precipitation event is the depth of the frost in the profile, and this is has been fairly big issue throughout much of the plains this winter and into Minnesota. It's on the lower right-hand side, and this is data. This is, again, much more sparse data, but still telling nonetheless. The depth of the frost penetration, Glasgow running about 6 inches, so not too much there, but down at 57 inches in Williston, 42 in Aberdeen, and still 20 down in Sioux Falls. So we have some very impressive frost depths going on at this point. Temperatures, the soil temperature profile are close to freezing, and especially in the eastern Dakotas, our soils are relatively dry, so the frost can go out relatively quickly. But we still do have some depth of frost penetration that we have to deal with. Okay, moving on to the big level of awareness here is where we are in the way of snowpack. Currently, this is from NRCS, snowpack consideration. We have areas here in Montana and Wyoming, running from 130 to 150 +% of average, and depending on the basin, from central and western Montana into northern Wyoming. All this is going to end up into the Missouri River Basin. You contrast that with where we were 3 years ago, and you see some very similar numbers at this point. I'm sure our friends in California and Nevada and Washington would like to see the numbers that they had 3 years ago than where they are right now. So this does bear watching, as we're seeing going along right now. Let's step along to data from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, tracking where we are in overall snowpack water content, comparing this current year, which is the blue shaded line, and this is inches of water equivalent on the left and month on the right. And the blue shaded area is where we are currently, and this compares to other years. Red line is the average accumulation, 30-year average. The darker blue is where we were in 2011, and then the light green is where we were in the other year of record, 1997. So it is interesting to compare. We are in the area of Fort Peck and Fort Peck to Garrison running slightly ahead of where we were back in 2011. But it also bears noting that we are somewhat less than where we were in 1997. So there is still a contrast there. Some data passed on to me by some folks in Montana and Wyoming from some of the SNOTEL stations, noting that some of the SNOTEL areas are either near record snowpack for the last 30 years, and we only have 30 years period of record in those SNOTEL locations, or top 5 in some of those. So this obviously is of interest and bears watching as we go along here, but it's not the whole story, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. Here are zoomed up images also from the Corps of Engineers passed on to me from those NRCS areas of larger basins in Montana in the upper left, Wyoming in the upper right, and Colorado down here in the center. So running 130, 145%, 150% in the Smith-Judas Mussel Shell, 154% in the upper Yellowstone. So there is a good amount of snowpack up in these areas, and we'll likely to continue to accumulate a bit more. Note that mid-April is about the time of the end of our peak accumulation period. So this bears watching for what happens with the total snowpack as we're going along. Kevin Lau, do you want to step in here at this point?
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to, well, first of all, I'm with the National Weather Service Missouri Basin River Forecast Center. Our office is responsible for putting out the real-time stage and flow forecasts for the basin. And I just wanted to contribute this one slide, and I'll talk briefly to it. I'll repeat a little bit about what Dennis has already said. We do recognize that we have an above-average mountain snowpack, and typically our accumulation period will end normally within a few days. So as Dennis said, we have picked up a little plains snowpack, but on the whole, the plain snowpack is still an insignificant player as far as we're concerned. The northern plain soils were deeply frozen through the wintertime, and we've begun to see some thaw there, as Dennis pointed out. And so the frozen ground condition is becoming less and less a factor. However, in the northern plains, we do have wetter than normal soils, especially in the central and western portions of the Dakotas. As you all know, we experienced significant flooding last month, both in Wyoming and in Montana, especially the Muscle Shale and the Bighorn come to mind, as well as in the Dakotas. We experienced significant flooding, and that was primarily based on runoff meeting ice-covered rivers. And so I want to assure folks that the threat due to ice-induced flooding, ice jam flooding, is gone. So what we saw last month as far as the significant flooding, we do not foresee that those causes, those factors are gone now. So with all that said, what we have here in the red blotches, if you will, are rivers that we do expect over the next 90 days. We run a 90-day outlook. And so statistically speaking, we believe that there's a likelihood of minor and some moderate flooding in western Montana in the Big Hole Basin and in the Gallatin. In Wyoming, we're looking at the Laramie and North Platte basins having the possibility of some minor flooding. And then in the lower third of the basin, we expect, and in fact, we have ongoing moderate flooding due to rains that fell over the past couple of days. So all of these, especially the lower third of the basin, this is typical. In fact, we've even got high water on the main stem below Jefferson City. Not flooding, but still high. So for the lower third of the basin, this is a typical setup. Other rivers to watch, we don't have, right now statistically, we don't have the likelihood, we don't have a 50% or better chance for flooding, but we are watching closely some of the tributaries to the Yellowstone, in particular the Clarks Fork Basin. Also, a lot of the tributaries in North and South Dakota. Again, we're not expecting flooding, but the wet conditions that are up there, we're keeping a close eye on those. And then, as I said, in Wyoming, or in Colorado, I mean, the foothills of the Rockies there in the South Platte headwaters, we're keeping a close watch on that. Again, we're not projecting flooding, but we're keeping a close eye on it. So overall, we at the National Weather Service River Forecast Center are not overly concerned, even with the above-average mountain snowpack. I'll turn it back over to you, Dennis.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate the input. All right, we'll step through. We've gone through some of the main conditions, the background conditions of where we are and what we have seen. Contrasted a little bit with 2011. Obviously, 2011 weighs heavily on people's minds, but there were some, there's some differences in the way of, what we've had in the way of plain snowpack versus 2011. One other difference that we're seeing this year compared to 2011 is that certainly in parts of the Dakotas, we've come off a couple-year period of wetness where we had large amounts of water standing in low-lying areas. So that's another difference we have this year is we don't have large amounts of as much water standing in low-lying areas. So some ability for runoff to occur in those, capture runoff in those areas. Okay, moving along to what we can say about the climate outlooks. These are all from the Climate Prediction Center. As part of NOAA, we're going to talk about what they're saying and then talk a little bit around them about what we can and cannot say. Stepping through the outlook from yesterday, the new one will be released today, but this is an 8 to 14-day outlook. And again, these are our probabilities, likelihood of occurrence of below or above average. Not necessarily saying amounts, but likelihoods of occurrences. So on the left-hand side, the likelihood of the areas in blue throughout most of the basin, the next 8 to 14-day period is going to stay below average in the way of temperature. We do have some warmer conditions coming throughout the plains the mid-latter part of next week, which will be welcome. But overall, we're going to stay generally in this northwest flow pattern where we keep getting more air out of Canada. From a precipitation standpoint, the far northern plains has a likelihood of some additional precipitation. These don't look to be major precipitation events, just smaller events with part of this northwest flow, at least in the next 8 to 14-day period. Moving on to April as a whole, this was updated the early part of this week, on Monday, in fact, on the 31st. You see a similar pattern that most of the northern plains is likely to stay below average in the way of temperatures throughout the month. We are seeing the start of a pattern change a little bit, but the overall pattern still indicates the likelihood of being somewhat cooler than average. From a precipitation standpoint, the white area indicates equal chances in that we don't have enough information to lean one way or the other towards below or above average precipitation. If we stay in this mostly northwest flow pattern with air coming out of Canada, that would lean towards lesser chances for precipitation, not big precipitation events. For bigger precipitation events, we need to get more of a trough going in the western U.S. and a ridge over the eastern U.S. And there are some hints of that happening somewhat more frequently, but the overall outlook still leans towards equal chances for below or above average in the way of precipitation. As we step ahead to the 3-month period, April through June, you see, again, a very similar pattern with more than likely staying cooler on the overall outlook, and then the EC, the equal chances throughout the basin. So not showing any indications that, well, one, from a precipitation standpoint, the cooler temperatures would slow the melt-off, whatever melt-off we have, and would slow soil warm-up. But we will be getting, average temperatures are increasing this time of year. We'll start the melt-off process, and we will be moving that process along. From a precipitation standpoint, again, we see no indications towards, and as much as we can say at this point, towards any large precipitation events. Our ability to forecast large precipitation events at any kind of distance ahead of time is somewhat limited, any large episodic events, but right now we don't have any indications that we can point to one way or the other. Just to complete the package here, the U.S. Drought Monitor map on the upper left-hand side, you can see that the basin is largely ringed by dry conditions around it, but very little in the way of U.S. Drought Monitor status in the basin. Some in Nebraska, Iowa, and part of Minnesota that do flow into the Missouri River. And the U.S. Drought Monitor outlook is indicating some improvement in those conditions are likely, although the dark brown area in Montana, or excuse me, in Nebraska would indicate drought ongoing at this point. One more slide, just I alluded to earlier about El Nino coming, kind of a coming attractions. It's looking more and more likely like El Nino is going to occur. This is a slide from the IRI, International Research Institute, at Columbia University. Each bar, or there's 3 bars that are above each 3-month period, and those indicate in red the chance of being El Nino, in green the chance of being neutral, non-El Nino or La Nina, and blue the chance of La Nina conditions. So as we go on to April, May, June here, or May, June, July, you see that the red bar, the El Nino chances are increasing, and that by the time we get to, summertime or late summer, the chance of being El Nino is the largest probability. So it's looking more and more like El Nino will impact us. When this actually occurs, it's kind of hard to say, but it looks more and more like as we go along into summertime, into fall, El Nino, and especially getting on in next winter, El Nino will be the most likely occurrence. And we'll watch that and talk more about that as we go along. Okay, so again, reiterating our key points, large mountain snowpacks are our concern right now, less so in the plains. They've been more episodic, but Kevin alluded to that's not our big driver at this point. Frozen soils going in the northern, western parts of the plains, central and west are somewhat moist and would lead to more runoff. Also, we haven't addressed here, but it is worth mentioning, the Bureau of Reclamation has a large number of reservoirs in those areas, especially in the western Dakotas, those reservoirs are relatively full due to the precipitation last fall. So there would be a little more capability of runoff from those. Temps still running cooler than average. Predictions, again, largely likely staying cooler than average. Average temperatures rapidly increase this time of year. Precipitation outlooks, equal chances for below or above average, but you also have to remember in this area that we are entering the higher precipitation time of year when the chances of precipitation are more likely, either from snow, which we still can have throughout the month of April, even early May, depending on temperature conditions, or more precipitation overall. That said, we don't have any indications of big precipitation events coming because of the overall situation with the Missouri. We will be watching for those, obviously very likely. El Nino coming. Kevin also mentioned some minor tributary flooding is expected in certain areas based on certain conditions. So that wraps up our major, the main part of the discussion right now. Again, we do have Kevin Lau, Kevin Stamm from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and some other partners on and available to answer questions, whatever questions you have at this point.
So this is Doug from NOAA, and I would just quickly say that if you do have a question, push pound and then 6, and then you should be able to talk. So we'll take them as they come. Anybody have any questions? Or comments?
Question for Kevin Lowe.
Sure.
Hey, Kev, talk this, and I hate to do this, but Sociology 101 happened at lunch today. Fair amount of sidebar discussion about projected releases from Garrison for next week. Can you speak to that, please?
I think that question is probably for Kevin Stamm.
I apologize.
From the Corps of Engineers.
Yeah, this is Kevin. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Kev, I can. Sorry about that.
Okay. This is Kevin Stamm with the Army Corps of Engineers. And right now it looks like our projected releases based on our 3-week forecast for Garrison, we're going to continue with a release of 18,000 through the weekend, and then as we continue for the next couple of weeks, slowly stepping it up. So the following week we would be at 20,000 cubic feet per second, going up to 22,000 looks like on about April 10th, and then making another increase to 24,000 on the 15th.
Thanks very much. We have our AOP next week, so I apologize for asking that, but there was a discussion that you were jumping up suddenly, and I thought that unusual. So thank you very much. Appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Next question.
Hi, this is Doug Holscher from the state of Iowa. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead, Doug.
To follow up on the question, I also had a question on the releases, and I guess if I'm hearing you correctly, there seems to be somewhat of an elevated risk of flooding, but also different conditions than a couple years ago. Can you just put in context the release rate and the schedule that was just outlined compared to kind of historic averages?
Hi, Doug. This is Jody Carhart, our management office for the Corps here in Omaha. And to put the releases in context, basically, first, if you look at the reservoir storage, we're still below normal because of the 2012 drought. So what we're anticipating is that we'll capture some of that water and store it this year, refill the reservoir system. And our releases will just be, right now what we're showing, is just navigation support releases. We're not adding to the navigation support to evacuate any flood storage, above and beyond what we need for navigation releases.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any next question? Jody, is the navigation releases at full service or at intermediate service at this point?
Right now, it's at intermediate service. We're halfway between full and minimum, between full and minimum service based on the 15 March storage check. Looking at all of our studies, it looks like we'll increase to full service after the July 1st storage check.
All right. Any other questions?
So I guess a quick one.
Sure.
This is Nancy Garter from the World Herald. So it sounds like absent heavy spring rains, you don't believe we'll see flooding. I mean, what would you characterize as the situation that would have you most worried?
Nancy, who are you addressing that to?
Well,
yeah. So I think there's two different ways of answering that question. There's a main stem question, and then I think Kevin can probably talk about the tributaries. Kevin Lau from the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center.
thank you.
So maybe the Corps can talk about the main stem in
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, Nancy. With the snow that we currently see up in the mountains, and projecting that it'll continue to rise a little bit. We're not quite to the peak accumulation time. The current soil conditions and normal type precip, like I said, we're going to refill the reservoirs this year and provide just navigation support. We're actually reduced navigation for the first half of the season. So absent some, extreme event across the upper basin, we don't anticipate that there would be any need to even evacuate water for flood control. If we did get some large runoffs, we would evacuate that additional water over the longest period of time possible at the lowest possible rate. So we would bump up our navigation support flows, add 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000, wherever we need to the releases that we're currently planning, and then stretch that out from now through December. So we'll monitor it. We watch it very carefully this time of year, and we can make those adjustments, any day if we would see things happen to change. I'll let Kevin talk about flood potential for the tributaries.
Thank you, Jody.
Hi, Nancy. This is Kevin. I would concur with what Jody just said. Even in the mountains with the snowpack that we have right now and the possibility for it to increase a bit more this month, we still do not show significant flooding due to snowmelt alone. So the snow that we have now will not lead to, or should not lead to, significant flooding. Now, the one caveat to that would be a very rapid warm-up. But barring that, and using the period of record temperatures that we have, statistically, we don't show flooding due to snowmelt alone. It would take a rainfall event to spark it. And then in the tributaries, again, snow is not the player now. It's just springtime convection. That's what will drive flooding in the Dakotas, Nebraska, the lower part of the basin. It's the unknown factor of rain. And right now, we suspect, and as I said earlier, we are having fairly significant flooding along the smaller tributaries in the state of Missouri, and that will continue through the spring. And that's a typical thing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Bet.
Any more questions? Okay. In that case, I'll thank you all for coming, and thank Dennis and all the question answerers for doing their jobs. We will have our next webinar on the 17th, and we'll send out information on that to remind you.